Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jake Stachewicz, and I'm excited to be here today giving this webinar with Golden Software. Today, I'm going to be covering how we can use Surfer to improve our contour maps and really take them to the next level. The topics that we're going to go over today are how to use the grid editor to make quick and precise edits, the different options for smoothing our contours, editing your contours as a base map, how to use Surfer 21's new feature to calculate the area and volume between contours, and finally, how to put the finishing touches on a professional quality contour map. There will be a few stopping points during the webinar where I take a couple minutes to answer any questions. You can send your questions to the webinar host via the Q&A located on the Zoom toolbar at any time. Type in your question and it will be sent to the webinar host, who will either answer it or forward it to me. And please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. This will allow the host to ensure we see all questions in a timely manner. Feel free to send in all your questions, and if we don't have time to answer them during the webinar, we will answer them via email once the webinar is complete. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and later this week, we're going to post the recording along with the data used in the webinar. We'll send each of you a link when it's posted so that you can test these examples out for yourself. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to look at today is using Surfer's grid editor. The grid editor is an indirect way to edit your grid files by changing the grid node values and updating the corresponding contours. The grid editor works best when you want to make just a few small changes to your already existing files. For our example, we're going to be using a relatively simple soil concentration contour map. And what we're looking to change is the sharpness of this specific point right here on our contour line. Ideally, we want a smoother line when we go to show it to our clients, and we also don't need this extra circle down here that was created from some outlier data in our grid file. Since these are smaller specific changes, we can go ahead and address them in the grid editor. We can open the grid editor in a few different ways. You can use the File Open command and choose your grid file. You can select your grid file in the Contents window, and then go to Map Tools, Edit Layer, Grid, or you can directly right-click your grid layer in the Contents window and choose Edit Grid. Once we have the grid editor open, we can see all of our grid nodes represented as these crosses and our node data represented as these X's. You may also notice that there's a difference in our contour lines from the original map, as that line that we want to edit is no longer here. We can see its outline in this darker orange color though. This is due to the default settings of the grid editor's contour intervals. To make sure we match our original contour map and grid editor lines up, let's go ahead and set those two windows side by side. We can do that from the View tab in the top ribbon. And then in Windows, there's a couple different options here. For my purposes, I have a lot of tabs, so Cascade is going to work well for me. Now let's go ahead and get these windows side by side. Right, and that looks pretty good. So now that we're side by side, let's compare the settings for our two windows. The contours property in the grid editor is largely the same as the levels tab in the property manager of our original contour map. The original contour map will have the map object and grid layer, while the grid editor will have different objects such as these node labels, node symbols, contours, and color fill. The grid editor will also have the unique grid editor tab up on the top ribbon. And since we're side by side now, we can compare the settings and the contours properties. And so when we look here in the levels of our original contour map, we can see that the minimum contour is 2, the maximum contour is 50, the contour interval is 2, and our major contour line is set to every 5. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate that over here in the contours section of the grid editor. We're going to set our minimum contour to 2, our max to 50, our interval to 2, and our major contour to every 5. And now we have the same settings, but it is a little bit hard to see our minor contour lines. And that's a pretty easy fix. It's also right here in the property manager in our grid editor. I'll just expand these line properties. And we can see that our color by default is set to 30% black. So if we just bump it up to something like 70% black, now our two contour maps look relatively the same. And we can see these minor contours. So we can get started editing by taking a look at all of our different tool options. Our first tool that we're going to talk about is the Z brush. The Z brush paints a specific Z value, which can be set right here in this section. We can also use the Z eyedropper to go ahead and click a node of interest and automatically pull the Z value, and it'll be populated in our Z section right here. So then, before I go ahead and paint this new Z value of 21.1 onto our grid editor, I'm going to drop the brush size down to 2 because I really want to just affect this area right here. And then if I go ahead and click and drag, I'll start painting that new Z value along these lines. When using the ZBrush tool, that initial first brush can be a little bit jagged, and the tools that I'm going to show you after this can help us smooth those lines out. But for the time being, we don't actually want to keep that change, so I'm just going to go ahead and press undo. Next, we have the warp tool. The warp tool allows you to drag values from one region of the map to another. With the warp tool and with all of our remaining tools, you'll see these density and pressure settings alongside the brush size. Density controls the weighting of the tool radically from the center of the brush and can be between 1 to 100. A density setting of 1 uses more feathering or blending of the values inside the brush and just outside of the brush, while a density setting of 100 means that all values inside the brush will be affected by the tool equally. The pressure option controls the speed that brush effects are applied, lower for a gentler effect or higher for a quicker change. And for our example, I'm going to go ahead and set both to 60. Now, since we know this is the line that we want to change, I'm going to go ahead and start pushing this hook down with the warp tool. You can see we're starting to smooth that out there. Now, if I want to smooth this out even further, I could start using the smooth tool. The smooth tool applies a weighted average to the grid nodes, and this works really well to come through after your initial change, just to make sure that it looks smooth and nothing jagged is going on. Next, we have the push down and pull up tools. The push down and pull up tools allow you to choose a grid node value and either push it up or pull it down. You want to be careful when using this brush, as if you go too far, you'll end up creating a new contour, like you can see here. If you do end up doing that, you can just go ahead and choose the opposite tool and bring it back down to how it was before you made the change. So now let's go ahead and finish up smoothing our line of interest over here so that it looks as good as possible for when we go to show it to our client. And then we also wanted to get rid of this outlier circle down here. And for that, we can use our last tool, which is the eraser tool. The eraser tool is pretty self-explanatory. It's going to erase your grid node values and turn them into no data. All you have to do is click and drag across the area you want to get rid of, and it will be gone from your grid. All right, And so now that we're happy with the changes we made in the grid editor window, we can go ahead and reload this grid to see what our changes look like in the map window. We can do this by clicking File, Save As, and giving this grid a new name, such as Smoothed, so that we don't overwrite our original grid. Pressing Save, and then we can close out of our grid editor window here. And if we want to restore our windows to how they were before we went to Cascade, I can just press the Maximize button here. This will be back to how it was before. All my tabs are still in the same place. And now the easiest way to reload this grid is going to be by clicking on the Contours layer in the Contents window. Then in the General tab of the Property Manager, clicking Open Grid next to the Grid File option, choosing our new smoothed grid file, pressing Open, and now we can see those changes are applied. If we wanted to do a quick comparison, I can add our original grid as a contour map on top of our new one. If I zoom in here, we can see how much we smoothed out this hook. And if I drag this over, you can see no more circle down here in the corner. And that's going to wrap up the grid editor section. Do we have any questions so far? Okay, one question I have is, can I show how the pressure and density settings affect the different tools? Sure thing, let me go ahead and get our grid editor open again. So with this, I'll go ahead and choose the warp tool. And then if I put the density and pressure down as low as, for example, 10, and I start trying to make the change, you can see it barely looks like anything's happening there. And if I really zoom in so that it displays the values, you can see how slightly we're pushing those values when we're at a value as low as 10. Okay, and a second question, is it possible to clip off the bottom where I erased the data on the bottom of the grid? And yes, you can do this by changing the limits on the grid in the grid mosaic, which would be here in grids. And this can only be done in a square or rectangle shape at this time, but it will help shave off dead space if you didn't want this extra dead space down here. And the mosaic is right here. Okay, great. Thank you for your questions, everybody. Our next topic is going to be a few different ways that we can smooth our contour lines. The first way we can do this is directly from the contour layer. In the General tab of the Properties Manager, we have this smoothing option. Right now it's set to none, but when we move it up to a different value, the smoothing option applies a constrained spline smoothing algorithm to interpolate additional contour vertices. And we have three options. We have a low, medium, and high option. I'm going to go ahead and click through all of these so we can see the difference between them. I would recommend choosing a specifically jagged looking line on our current map and watching how the different options change our map. So the difference between low to none is going to be pretty subtle. And then, as our options would indicate, as we go down to a higher value like medium, the algorithm is going to get applied more heavily. And then finally on high, we'll have a really high smoothing algorithm applied. You can see this looks nice and smooth. These circles had some jagged edges initially, and they look pretty good now. And with this smoothing option, each line is separately calculated, and accordingly, the lines can cross if too much smoothing is applied. If that happens, we can use a different method, such as the spline smooth tool. To show you guys the spline smooth tool, I'm going to go ahead and set the smoothing back to none. And the spline smooth tool is found right here in the grids tab in the edit section. You can go ahead and click grid spline smooth. This is going to open up our spline smooth dialog where I can choose an input grid. So I'm going to choose our contours wells that we already have open. And once our grid is selected, we can choose between the two methods the spline smooth tool uses: insert nodes and recalculating the grid. The insert nodes method will expand the grid by preserving the original grid nodes in a smooth grid, and new grid nodes will be added between those original grid nodes. We can choose how many nodes to insert here at the number nodes to insert dialog, and we can specify how many between rows and between columns. The other option is to recalculate the grid, which when chosen is going to gray out the number nodes to insert and activate the final grid size option. Recalculating the grid will increase or decrease the number of rows and columns in a new grid file. The original grid node locations will be lost unless they exactly match up with a new calculated node. The smooth grid file will still be an accurate representation of your original data, though. The recalculate option with spline smooth is also very helpful if you need to do grid math between two grids, as both grids are required to have the same number of rows and columns. If your grids don't match, you can do a quick spline smooth to fix it. But for our purposes, let's go with the insert nodes method. I'm going to bump both of these numbers up to 4. If I wanted to, I could use a different number between rows and between columns. Like I could do 4 and 3, but for our purposes, just 4 is going to work fine. Then we're going to go ahead and add this as a new contour layer to our existing map. Press OK. And now I can zoom in on some of these areas that we made changes to. And you can see how we smoothed out some of these jagged edges. This is even more clear if I toggle between our original and smoothed. That's going to go ahead and cover our smoothing options. So next we are going to get into how to edit your contours as a base map. So for this next section, we're going to cover converting these contours to a base map for editing. With this example, we are looking at contours of a flood area. And if I zoom into this section right here, you can see we have some funky outlier circles here that are actually a part of this same 2300 level that goes all the way through here. Personally, I think they don't fit in that well, and I would like to delete them. And then over here, I also am not a fan of this weird hook that's going on. I would rather one smooth contour line. And so once we are able to delete these outliers, I'll go ahead and show you how we can edit just this single contour line so that it's smoothed. Now, to delete these outliers, we could delete the entire level, which I'll show you an example of shortly, but that is going to delete this entire level that we wanted to keep. To delete the entire level, we would select the contours layer in the contents window, then go to the levels tab in the properties manager, change the level method to advanced, click edit levels, and that's going to open up our levels for map dialog. In this dialog, I can choose just the 2300 level and make edits here. If I want to delete it, I could click this delete option over here on the right. But like I said, we're not going to do that. So instead, I'm going to double click on the line properties, change the line style to invisible, press OK, press apply, and now we can see what it would look like if we got rid of those polygons, but also the entire level. So instead what I'm going to do is change that line style back to solid, and I'm going to change the color to bright red so that I can actually highlight this level. So when I convert it over to a vector-based layer, I can know what to edit once it is in that layer. Now I'm going to go ahead and close the levels for map dialog. And if we want to export our contour lines to a vector format, we can do that from the map tools up here in the top ribbon. And then in the layer tools, I can select export contours. Export contours is preferred over a standard export, since this option only exports the lines from our selected layer and will convert them into vector objects. It won't grab other things that we don't want, such as these contour labels, the axes, and the axes labels. So now let's go ahead and save this as a new file called outflood contours. And we have a couple different file types we could choose. I prefer DXF, as if you saved it as a shape file, you would create a couple extra reference files that can be clunky to deal with. So let's go ahead and save this as a DXF, press save. And then we can add this to our already existing map by going to Home, Add to Map, Base, and choosing our Outflood Contours DXF. Press OK on the import options. And now we can see that we've added this as a new base layer to our map. And Surfer recreated the vector layer nearly identically to the original contours. If I toggle between them, the only difference you can see is the contour layer has the labels. Another reason that I added the DXF file as a new layer instead of a new map is that it's nice to have the contour layer underneath it as a reference point. If I zoom in here, you can't really tell that there is a red highlight underneath, but if I successfully delete these polygons in the base layer, that red highlight is going to shine through and we'll know that it's gone from our base layer. So now let's get started on editing this base layer. And sometimes when working in a base layer with so many objects like this one has, as you can see, it can be hard to get the exact selection that you want. You can see I'm trying to click on these polygons, but some other contour line is taking precedence. And a way to get around this would be to right-click directly on the base layer, click Open Attribute Table to open our attribute table. And now we have our attribute table with our Z levels, because when we exported this from DXF, we did carry that Z level over. And now since we know that our polygons that we want to delete have a 2300 Z level, I can scroll down to 2300 here in the attribute table. And if I click on our first 2300 3D polygon, we can see that it also selects this polygon here in the top corner and the 3D polygon in the contents window. And that's because the attribute table is a modal dialog, so it would happen on anything that I click. So now I'm going to go ahead and shift click to choose multiple polygons, and I'm going to shift click down the line and start selecting all of our polygons that we wanted to delete. If I end up going one too far, since I probably just selected one of these 3 polygons, I can shift click directly above the last option I clicked on, and it'll go ahead and unselect that one. So now, just to confirm I have the right polygons selected before deleting them, I can hide these polygons by checking this green checkbox right here in the contents window. When I click that, it's going to hide all the polygons at once. And now we can see that red shining through. So these are the right polygons that I want to delete. So I'm going to go ahead and just right click and delete all of these polygons that don't have a check mark next to them in the contents window. All right, so that took care of those outlier circles that we wanted to get rid of. Now let's talk about this hook over here. So a similar problem for trying to select just the line. We don't necessarily know if we have the right line here. If you go to the Features tab and choose Reshape to go ahead and select it, you can see now I know that I have the right line selected because all of the vertices are highlighted. And to reshape this, we were going to use the Reshape tool anyway. So now I can go ahead and start dragging these vertices to a desired location to go ahead and smooth out this contour line. While I was doing this, I could also press Control-click to add more vertices to the selection if I wanted to have more customization options. But what's actually going to work best for smoothing this line out is going to be selecting the vertices, pressing Delete on the keyboard, and turning this into a smooth line. Right. So now we've got a little more continuous of a smooth line here. And typically after editing a line in this manner, I would recommend using the Smooth tool, which is up here next to the Reshape tool. But since we're in Surfer 21, all of our objects were exported as 3D polylines and polygons, and not all of our feature editing options are available in 3D. To convert this to 2D for smoothing, we can just go ahead and directly right-click on our 3D polyline, go down to Change To, and choose Polyline. And now we can see I have these thin and smooth options available to me. So if I go ahead and click the Smooth tool, we'll get into the line smoothing dialog, and I can choose to add a number of points in between our already existing points on this line. You can go as excessive as you want here. You could get up to nearly 1,500 points on the line if you desired. For our purposes though, just one additional point is going to do plenty fine. So I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And then if I zoom in here, we can see some areas where that smoothing benefited us right here and over there. Now, before we move on to converting this, one quick tip for when to use this Thin tool. The Thin tool removes extra vertices on a line, and this is best for when you're trying to create a new grid from these contours, but you have so many vertices on the map that it's actually slowing down the grid processing speed. So now we can turn this DXF file with our edits back into a grid that we can contour. And we can do that by selecting grids up here in the top ribbon, choosing new grid, grid from contours. And in the grid from contours dialog, we can choose our contour source, which is going to be our base vector layer. Then it's going to ask us to choose our Z field, which is going to be our Z level. Press OK. Now we can see we've loaded our 218 contours and 7,800 some vertices. This would be the prime time to use the Thin tool. If you saw this number and it was obscenely high, you could come through with the Thin tool and just drop some of your vertices to speed up your gridding process. We're going to keep the rest of our gridding options here as the defaults, and then we're going to go ahead and add this as a contour map, as a contour layer to our already existing map. So let's go ahead and press OK. Press OK. And let's zoom out and minimize this base layer and actually go ahead and turn it off. So now we can see that hook's different. And if I was to go ahead and turn off our original contour layer, there are no more red outlier circles here. I think that this looks great. Our edits are how we want them to, and our lines have the same quality as the original contour map that we gridded. If you're wondering why we want to go through the trouble of gridding the base layer a second time, it's because in order to create a contour layer in Surfer, you are required to use a grid file. And contour layer types have more customization options, like changing the interval, color scheme, and labels than a base layer does, that most people are interested in using. And that is going to go ahead and wrap up editing our contours as a base map. Do we have any more questions? Okay, it looks like we have a question back from the grid editor section. Do we need to keep density and pressure the same in the grid editor? You don't need to keep them the same. If you wanted to, you could put like 30 and 10. And then a second question after that is why you would use different values. So the density tool controls the weighting of the tool within the brush. So if you have a higher density value in the brush, everything within the brush, all the grid node values are going to be changed exactly the same. Where if you have a lower density value, it'll be kind of a blending of all the values inside of the brush. And the pressure tool just controls the speed that the tool effects are applied. So if you wanted, for example, a like feathered blending, you would have a low pressure, but a low density, excuse me, but you wanted that effect to happen quickly, you would have a high pressure. And I'll go ahead and demonstrate what I was just talking about really quick back here in our grid editor section. So here we have the warp tool. So low density and high pressure. I'll zoom into our values. And we can see there's not that our grid values are being changed differently. They're not all being changed exactly the same, but that effect is happening much faster because I have a high pressure. Okay, and I'm not seeing any other questions, so let's go ahead and move on to our next section of the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and delete these extra layers first. Okay, and so now we have our contour lines looking how we want, but before we take this map up to publication quality, let's first take a look at the volume and area calculations of these contours. Starting in Surfer 21, we implemented a new feature that allows you to automatically calculate the contour volume and area of your map without using any extra scripts or function writing. To do so, all we have to do is go to Grids in the top ribbon. Then under Calculate, choose the Contour Volume and Area option. In the Contour Volume and Area dialog, you would choose your input grid, which we're going to use our outflood contours. Once you choose your grid, Surfer automatically pulls the minimum contour and maximum contour from your grid Z values. And you can go ahead and set this to any range of values that you would want that is within your grid. And then the contour interval option, changing the interval will change the number of levels that we receive values for. So at an interval of 100, we would see 2000, 2100, 2200, and so on. And so just using these three options, we can be as broad or as specific as we would like. And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and set our max contour to 2400 because this is a flood area that we're looking at, and I'm mostly interested in the contour volume of our lower elevation areas. So I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And then I'll pull our contour volume and area report over into this screen. So we can see our contour areas and values as they correspond to that 100 contour interval. Our results are going to be in the same units as your grid. So for best results, you're going to want to make sure that your grid is set to a meaningful coordinate system. And that's all that needs to be done to calculate contour volume and area now in Surfer 21 and up. So since we have that information, let's go ahead and get this map ready for presentation. First, we're going to fill our contours so that we can bring some color into this map. The easiest way to do that is to select your contours layer in the contents window, go to the Levels tab in the Properties Manager, and click the Fill Contours box here. After that, you're going to want to choose a Fill Colors color scale that you think looks best. I'm a fan of one called Blue, Green, Orange, Red. And once our contours are filled, we can also go ahead and turn on a color scale by checking this box right here. Now we have this color scale here on the side. And if we want to really customize how our filled contours look, we can start changing our level methods. Our level methods are simple, logarithmic, equal area, and advanced. I'm going to go ahead and go with equal area for our purposes. Once I choose equal area, our contours separate into approximately equal area bins, and the contour lines are set at those boundaries. And once our level method is set, I can really dive into customizing our color map by clicking the three little dots right here in the corner of the filled colors. And that's going to open up our color map editor, which has all of these customization options. First thing we can notice is this histogram that has nodes of our colors. And then this darker gray area in the background is actually our data values and where our data values fall under these color nodes. And you might notice right now that our data actually isn't being captured very well by this color scheme and method. We've only got most of our data is falling within 2.5 colors. And we can fix this by changing the stretch option to equalize. And now all of our color nodes are compressed around our data. If we felt we wanted to add more color nodes, you could just double click on the line and Surfer is going to automatically equalize them with the new color node. So now let's go ahead and press apply to see what this looks like. And I already like this much better with this contrast and color scheme, much better with this stretch option. So now we can move past color, and we also have the opacity mapping options in the color map editor. These opacity nodes work the same as the color mapping ones above. They're represented by all of the data in here. So right now we have 2 that's covering all of our data. And since the nodes are representing all of our data, if I go ahead and change our opacity to something like 70 and press apply, it'll make the entire map more opaque. Just making the entire map more opaque doesn't do much for us though. So if we want to better customize this to apply opacity to certain levels, for example, we can start by double clicking on the line to add some new nodes. And once our new nodes are added, I can type in a custom data value that I want everything higher than to be completely opaque. So for our example, I'm going to choose 2400. And then since this node is connected to this one, I'm going to set the opacity to 100 so that everything going in this direction is not opaque at all. And then I'm going to click on our second node, and I'm also going to set its data value to 2400. And then if I set this one's opacity to 0, all of the data values going forward from this point will be completely transparent. So I'll go ahead and click apply. And now we can see that that did do what we wanted. Everything above 2400 is completely see-through. So I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And this can be a really effective presentation tool if you also have aerial imagery of your contour area, which we do. So I'll go ahead and turn that on. And I find this to be an especially effective presentation tool since this is a flood area And now all of our higher elevations are represented by the actual terrain of the area, and our lower elevation flood risk areas are highlighted by the filled contours. If you want to make this an even more impressive visual, since this is a grid file, we can actually view this in Surfer's 3D view by clicking on the map in the contents window. Then we go View, 3D View. And we can really see how our flood area is represented by those filled contours. Going all the way up into here, and with our low point being over here. Now, with our aerial imagery, it's actually draped over our contour lines, and so that's why it looks like the real mountains. If I just uploaded this aerial imagery, you wouldn't be able to view it in the 3D view. But now let's say you don't love the filled contour look. We can create a map that utilizes just the contour lines and customize those for a better presentation quality. So to do that, first I'm going to exit out of this 3D view. And then we're going to click on our contours in the contents window, go back to the levels tab. And first I'm going to turn off our fill contours and our color scale. And then we can change the level method to advanced. Then we're going to click edit levels to open this levels for map dialog again. Since we were just using the equal area level method, our levels have been shifted slightly, and I can easily reset that by clicking on the level header, clicking use defaults, pressing OK, and now our levels are back to what they originally were on import. Now, if I want to edit all of these lines at once, I can click on the line header to open this line properties dialog. And to step this up from a black and white contour, let's give it a gradient color scale. So to do that, I need to click gradational here in the properties. And then I can click on color. And this is going to open up a color map editor just for our contour lines. And I'm going to go ahead and choose that color scale we just used, the blue, green, orange, red. Press apply, and now you can see we have a gradient color scale where our highest points are represented by red lines. So I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And if I wanted to make it even more clear what our high elevation points were, I could add a line width gradient as well, which I can do by adding a value here to the max width option. I would recommend using a very small value because if you go too high, you're going to have incredibly thick lines. So I'm going to use 0.04. Press OK, press apply. And now we can see our highest elevation is a bright red and thick line as compared to our lower elevations, which are thin blue lines. So I'm going to go ahead and press OK to get out of that. But now that our lines are set, our labels are a little difficult to see against this aerial image. We can change those here also in the Levels tab by expanding the font properties under Labels. The quickest way to make these more visible is going to be by increasing the background opacity using this slider. Right now the background color is set to white, but our opacity is at 0, so you can't see that. As I move the slider up, we'll start seeing some white rectangles appear behind our labels, and now they're more visible. But still, this 3300 one, for example, is pretty hard to see. So we can directly reposition these labels by going to Map Tools, Edit Layer, Contour Labels. That's going to give us this blue selection box around our labels. And I can just directly click and drag this to a new location. And you can see now it's a little more visible. I could do it with any of them if I wanted to. And if you wanted more labels, you could add a new one onto the nearest contour line by using Control-Click. And now I have a new label. And now finally, to wrap this up, we could also view this in Surfer's 3D view if that's how you wanted to present your map. And we would do that by clicking on the map in the contents window, going to View, 3D View. And we have a 3D model of this again. With this one specifically, I think our colors look a little bit muted here. And we can fix that by going to the Lighting tab in the Properties Manager and adjusting the light position until our colors look a little more bright and vibrant there. Okay, and that is going to wrap up the last section of this webinar. Do we have any final questions? Okay, one question. Can I automatically bring the nodes from the color map editor into the opacity mapping so they're the same? So currently we can't do that, but your feedback is very important to us and that is a good idea. So we will go ahead and add your vote to that as a new feature down the line. And if anyone else would like this feature, let us know and we'll add your vote too. Okay, I'm going to quickly talk about the bottom of the levels tab here, which is curve tolerance and label spacing, as well as edge distance. So when you, so if you up your curve tolerance, it will change it'll change how many labels are added based on where a curve happens in your contours. You can see going down takes them away, going up adds more. And so basically, in essence, it just means that a higher curve tolerance means you can have your labels on a tighter curve. And then label to label distance, that is going to a lower label to label distance means that your labels can be closer together. Going up means that you want them farther apart, so that will also happen. And then label to edge distance is pretty similar to label, but it has to do with the edge of your map instead. So if I have it all the way down to 0, you can see I've added this label here at the edge of my data. Okay, and I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment. And so if you have any more questions that come up, feel free to reach out to us at either of these email addresses and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. I'll stick around here for a couple more minutes if you have any more last minute questions. Thanks again for joining, everybody. We really do appreciate you taking the time to come out.